Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the conference La Flaneuse and the Modern City. As we are in the infinite Zoom space, I would like to first give you the context of this conference and welcome you to the Liebling House, located in the heart of Tel Aviv, which is hosting this event. The Liebling House is a cultural center dealing with architecture, conservation, and urbanism. Modern architecture and the White City is our starting point for discussions on life in the city in the past, present, and future. We are a German-Israeli cooperation between the German Federal Ministry of Interior Building and Community and the Tel Aviv municipality. My name is Sabrina Zegla. I'm an architect and curator and part of the founding team of the Liebling House since 2015. I have curated several projects at the Liebling House, including the permanent exhibition, telling the story of the White City as a starting point for discussion. Today, I curate the residency program at the Liebling House and the project room. La Flaneuse is the current exhibition at the project room I curated. It is showing the work by artists Nelly Agassi and Maya Raviv. This exhibition is actually the inspiration and generator of our conference today. Before we start the talks of our distinguished guest speakers, Professor Despina Strodikakos, Dr. Sigal Davidi, and Professor Emerita Mary Pepczynski, which I will introduce in an elaborate way before each talk, I would like to introduce the concept of the project room, hosting the exhibition La Flaneuse, as well as the exhibition itself and the work process, connecting historical research and artistic interpretation. I will share now my screen with you and with a little presentation. Perfect. So, the Liebling House Project Room is a space in which artists from various disciplines are invited to actively participate in a critical reflection on the question, what is the White City? As part of an alternative, collaborative, and ongoing investigation on the White City as a platform for discourse regarding conservation, urbanism, identity, and culture in Tel Aviv. The project room is the open end of the permanent exhibition at the Liebling House, which tells the story of the White City as a point of departure for a story in the making. In this slide, you can see the three exhibitions that have been shown in the project room and by architectural historians, urbanists, filmmakers, and artists addressing different topics and points of view on the White City. As you can see, the first exhibition was called A Matter of Data by Ines Weitzman and the Center for Documentary Architecture. The second one was by the urbanist Paul Cairns and Moti Rouimi, A Great Place to Live, asking for who the white is, who is the White City, and who lives in it, and what makes it a great place to live, and if at all. And we have now our third exhibition, La Flaneuse, and which I will elaborate on in a moment. So we can see that this is creating a multifaceted research platform. Thus, the question, what is the White City, remains open, inclusive, and diverse. Nelly Agassi and the animator Maya Raviv proposed to address the question, what is the White City, via La Flaneuse, a female figure who wanders around the White City, assuming and abstracting its buildings as if they were dresses. La Flaneuse seeks to decipher the changing city as if it were a fabric, wishing to reappropriate it through means considered feminine. This was the starting point of Nelly and Maya's proposal for the project room. After it was accepted in an open call procedure, our work together was to decide on the content the Flaneuse will meet in the White City and address. After a long debate about the architectural heritage of the White City, the known and forgotten heritage, I proposed that they have a look at the research by Sigal Davidi on women architects in Mandatory Palestine. Finally, this was the base for their work on the exhibition, like a match made in heaven. They took the historical architecture plans of 3 public buildings designed in the 30s and 40s by women for the women of the city, buildings whose construction was initiated by women's organizations such as Vitsa, the Women Workers Council, and the Women's League for Israel, which Sigal Davidi will elaborate on in her talk. I would like to show you for a few brief moments the video installation La Flaneuse. I hope you can hear sound. So that was part of the beautiful installation La Flaneuse, showing now in the project room. Agassi and Raviv offer a new relationship between La Flaneuse and the city by evoking forgotten visions, activities, and the female presence in Tel Aviv's urban space. La Flaneuse is also an architect who shapes and dismantles her environs. Her figure comes forth in the series of collages made from historical architectural plans, as you can see in this slide, which is made by the plans of these 3 public buildings. You can see the details of these buildings underneath the image. Sorry. In other works, the architectural plans and elements become patterns of dress. In these works, the architectural plans become patterns of dresses in Agassi's collages, or are translated back into fabric, as we can see in Raviv's work, Soft Plan, in which the paper plans and the hard structure have become a soft felt object, recalling traditional female craft. These transitions echo discourse about the entry of women into the architecture profession in Europe in the early 20th century, which will also be discussed in the following talk by Despina Stradigatos. In this work, which is called neither velvet nor silk, fabric becomes the soft building material that bridges between the traditional female role in the domestic sphere to the urban public role, as can be seen in this work. Here the fabric breaks through the exhibition space, formerly an apartment living room, floods the apartment balcony. In so doing, it represents the move of women architects from planning the domestic space traditionally perceived as feminine into the public space perceived as masculine, and the manifestation of these domestic skills on an urban scale. So I will stop now. So this was about the exhibition, and I will just stop the share so we can move to the second part of our talk, and I will just conclude that I wanted to share with you these visions of the some scenes of the exhibition, and also to reflect on this idea of combining academic research with artistic representation, and in this way also adding another layer to the whole way of perceiving these researches and this information, and they work on and add additional. They work on different sensors and also on a very emotional level, and I think it is a very interesting concept to continue and to explore. And today in our conference, we will discuss the borrowed figure of the female wanderer, and to examine the relation between the modern city and the women who conceived, planned, designed, initiated, and often also financed its development. La Flaneuse represents a change in the status of women that began in the 20th century after long periods in which they did not have equal rights concerning action and visibility in the urban space, which was largely defined as masculine. In the conference, we will move between periods, cities, and continents to examine the challenges these cities presented and the hopes they raised among women who led active lives in them. 3 international scholars were invited to address this topic. Our guests today are, as I said, 3 international scholars who are working on putting together a missing history of women architects and their role in the modern project in architecture and city planning. This act of placemaking is in the historical urban space is crucial to our understanding of the present moment. I'm very, very happy to introduce our first speaker, Professor Despina Stradigakos, and her talk, The Flaneuse and the Architectin, Contradictory Models of Female Modernity. Despina is a writer, historian, and professor. Her research explores how power and ideology function in architecture, whether in creating a domestic space or of a world empire. She is the author of 4 books, including A Woman's Berlin, Building the Modern City, which traces the history of forgotten female metropolis. So Despina, I'm very, very happy to have you, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. All right. How does that look?
It's good.
It's good? Okay, thank you. So hello, everyone, and I'm delighted to be joining you from Buffalo. So in my talk, I will juxtapose 2 figures who emerge in relation to the rise of the modern city and who represent fundamentally different modes of urban engagement, the Flaneuse and the Architektin, the German term for a female architect. The Flaneuse represents an experience of urban modernity focused on movement, fleeting impressions, and pleasurable anonymity. By contrast, the Architektin is associated with women's efforts to become visible and take space. So I seek to bring these two figures into a productive tension in order to explore differences in women's responses to the development of the modern city. So Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Baudelaire, and other 19th century writers defined a way of experiencing the city that involved moving through the streets as part of an anonymous mass while remaining a detached and aloof observer. Their flaneur was a well-to-do aristocrat strolling the streets and thereby conspicuously displaying his wealth and leisure. By the turn of the 20th century, however, more and more bourgeois men embraced flânerie. As journalists, writers, and theorists of urban life, they drew their inspiration from the city streets and composed their observations into novels, short stories, and journalistic reports. For them, the detached vision of the flaneur was an analytic mode that allowed them to investigate and codify the experience of the modern city. In Germany, the high period of flânerie occurred between 1900 and 1930, a period of rapid urban expansion. The nation's capital, Berlin, flourished, and with its prospering artistic and cultural scene, offered the flaneur ideal working conditions. During the Weimar Republic, Walter Benjamin's descriptions of Berlin and Paris from the vantage point of its streets and arcades presented the flaneur as both a product of modern life and its keenest observer. The adoption of the Weimar Constitution in 1919 legally guaranteed women in the new republic equal rights with men. Nonetheless, although women were theoretically on the same footing with men, cultural attitudes were slow to change. Then, as before, it was understood that women should not roam the streets alone and without purpose. Flânerie was thus conceived almost exclusively as a male activity. Today, writers, artists, curators, and scholars are challenging that view and introducing us, as in the Liebling House exhibition, to the female figure of the flaneuse. We see her engaging in a different set of activities, browsing bookstores, bicycling, sightseeing, and window shopping, forms of urban appropriation deemed more respectable for women at the time. Shopping, especially in the form of the department store, has attracted special attention among scholars interested in reconstructing moments of female flânerie. More recently, attention has been shifting to women as producers of urban space, which challenges the flaneur as the default figure of urban modernity. So in the time remaining, I will suggest an alternative way of thinking about women's negotiation of public spaces, one that posits a different subjectivity and strategy of appropriation from that of the flaneur and the flaneuse. So I'll begin with an unusual text. In 1913, a novelty appeared in Berlin bookstores. Was die Frau von Berlin wissen muss, What a Woman Must Know About Berlin, was a guide to the city written by and for women. After 2 centuries of housewifery manuals that instructed women on their duties to family and home, this book encouraged women to look outward to find their lives and identities in the streets and institutions of the modern city. Led by the reassuring voices of female experts, readers embarked on a voyage to the terra incognita of an anatomy classroom, political assemblies, and newspaper offices, among other traditionally male realms. Alongside these incursions, the book described the rise of a visibly different gendered landscape as female patrons and builders began to define and construct architectural spaces for women. Mapping the capital from a female perspective, the guidebook equated the modernity of urban living with a new kind of energetic and outgoing woman who embraced the metropolis as her own. The guidebook emphasized the presence, order, and permanence of women in the urban public sphere. This emphasis on visibility and rootedness makes sense in the context of the disparity in agency experienced by men and women in this period. The bourgeois flaneur, who embraced the modern urban experience as one of placelessness and fluidity, had fixed spaces of his own in the city if he chose to inhabit them. He could, in other words, afford the luxury of leaving no traces. As urban citizens, women were already disappeared, a problem they shared with other marginalized urban populations. In contrast to the flaneur's desire to go unnoticed, the challenge women faced lay in becoming visible. To do so was critical at the turn of the 20th century, as the spatial upheavals associated with the development of the modern industrial city turned urban topographies into highly competitive and contested sites. Nowhere were these changes and tensions more evident than in Berlin. From German unification in 1871 to the end of the 19th century, the city's population rose from 826,000 to 3 million. Its boundaries expanded apace, rivaling London as the largest city in Europe. To its detractors and champions alike, Berlin epitomized the tempo, processes, and appearance of modernity. Frenzied construction seemed to overtake the capital, leading long-term residents to complain that they barely recognized their own city. Like other groups struggling to make their presence felt in a rapidly transforming urban landscape, middle-class women grasped the importance of spatial capital. With the city sprawling in all directions and new buildings going up at an overwhelming pace, women understood that their claim to urban power rested in part on being able to express it visibly in physical form. By the turn of the 20th century, women's lives were changing just as rapidly and dramatically as Berlin itself. In increasing numbers, women pursued higher education and professional careers, a change that threatened to revolutionize conventional gender and family roles. The emergence of independent women, an unprecedented social type, produced new architectural needs as women broke away from the domestic spaces that had defined the traditional orbit of their lives. As individuals, they lacked offices and studios, dining rooms that made a lone woman feel welcome, places to entertain clients or relax with friends, and at the end of the day, a place to call home. Collectively, they also needed schools, clubhouses, exhibition venues, and commercial spaces, indeed, a whole architectural infrastructure to sustain an emerging urban culture of emancipated women. Women devised a variety of strategies to finance building projects, including the establishment of women's building cooperatives, which emerged in Berlin around the same time that the city witnessed the opening of Europe's first women's bank, managed solely by and for women. These new organizational forms and institutions allowed women to accumulate the capital necessary to build on a monumental scale. In exploring their evolving urban identities, female clients turned to women architects to help them define and articulate their spatial needs. The newly minted female graduates of Germany's architectural programs a few of which you see here. We're glad for the work. Technical universities had only recently opened their enrollments to women, and the architectural community remained skeptical about their abilities. Berlin, with its abundant economic and cultural opportunities, as well as a supportive community of professional women, soon became a center for female architects and designers. So I will quickly show you some of the new buildings that women in Berlin commissioned in the years before the First World War. All of the projects I will discuss were designed by Emilia Winkelmann, who opened her office in Berlin in 1907, and who was strongly supported by female patrons. The Lyceum Club on Lutzowplatz in the Tiergarten district served the members of the Lyceum Club, which was established in 1905 in Berlin as an association for female artists, writers, professionals, and entrepreneurs. And the little blue arrow shows you where the building is located. 10 years after the club's founding, the members commissioned a new clubhouse that facilitated their access to the public sphere and that provided them with much needed spaces to socialize, conduct business, host meetings, dine, and unwind. In the building's facade, the architect employed a simple, rational style to communicate the occupants' modernity. The house in Der Sonne, or House in the Sun, in Potsdam was commissioned by a coalition of women's professional organizations, which brought together teachers, nurses, musicians, and home economists to erect a housing complex for retired career women. During this period, the first generation of women who had pursued higher education and careers in the last quarter of the 19th century were reaching retirement age. Having fought for their freedom as young women, they did not want to enter stifling institutional homes in their old age. The House in the Sun opened in June 1914, and it encompassed a villa-like building with self-contained apartments, which you see here, a small communal dining building, on-site caretakers to offer a helping hand when needed, expansive green spaces, and easy access rail to the center of Berlin. The appearance of the residence blended with the surrounding neighborhood of villas and communicated the respectable domesticity of the occupants. The final building I will show you addresses the spatial needs of younger women. The Victoria Studion House opened in 1914 as a residence for female university students in Berlin. At the time, there were no student dormitories, and women who wanted to attend the university but could not live with their families had a very hard time finding anyone who would rent to them. In the Victoria Studion House, Winkelmann created a novel form of architecture in Berlin, the closest thing the city had to an American-style college campus. Located in Charlottenburg, the building incorporated an auditorium, classrooms, living and reading rooms, a dining hall, library, art studios, a gym, and 96 single rooms for students. A secluded garden, dining terrace, and sports area were located at the rear of the building. The neoclassical facade communicated the inhabitants' learning and status as citizens of the public sphere. So I will end with this map from a later promotional brochure that advertised the Victoria Studion House's integration into a broader urban network. And I added that little blue arrow so that you can find the building. Although the residence was designed to give young women a nurturing and protective home in the city, the intention was by no means isolationist. Indeed, the location of the Victoria Studion House was selected to provide easy access to the resources of the city. This form of embeddedness in an urban network also expressed in the Woman's Guidebook, envisions freedom and movement in the city, but along ordered trajectories. Now, this represents the antithesis to the creative meanderings of the Flaneuse. Both Architektin and Flaneuse are concerned with agency, but they approach it from radically different subject positions. For the Architektin, the challenge is to appear on the urban grid, while the Flaneuse seeks to drop out. The Architektin fosters visibility through prominent anchor points in the city and a careful use of architectural language. Her work seeks to materialize both a female collective in the city and individual women. By contrast, the Flaneuse seeks to leave no traces as she passes through urban streets. The Architektin enables women to move through the city by furrowing into the soil. The Flaneuse glides on the surface and disappears. The Architektin proclaims, "I am here." The Flaneuse states, "I once was." It is the shock of seeing the Architektin that constitutes her power. It is the surprise of not seeing the Flaneuse that constitutes hers. For all their differences, the Architektin and the Flaneuse are like-minded spirits, each insisting on an urban experience that they shape on their own terms. Both find freedom in the city's spaces and refuse to let others determine their path. But they pursue that liberty in a diametrically opposed manner. The embedded presence that empowers the Architektin traps the Flaneuse, and the ephemerality and anonymity craved by the Flaneuse deprives the Architektin of her voice. Yet both are figures at the core of urban modernity. By considering the Architektin along with the Flaneuse, we enrich and deepen our understanding of what it meant to be and feel like a modern woman in the city.
Thank you so much, Despina, for this very insightful and inspiring talk. And before we move on to our next talk, I just wanted to mention what I didn't mention before is that you're very welcome to send us questions, which we will address later in our panel. So feel free to write questions and they will be addressed later on. And now to our next talk and speaker, Dr. Sigal Davidi, who will talk about women architects and women's organization in mandatory Palestine. Dr. Sigal Davidi is an architect and architectural historian. Her research focuses on relations between nationality, immigration, gender, and old age, and the modern architecture of mandatory Palestine and Israel. Her book, Building a New Land, Women Architects and Women's Organization in Mandatory Palestine, appeared in Hebrew in 2020. And as I said before, her work is the basis and inspiration for the exhibition La Flaneuse. Thank you, Sigal.
Okay, I will show my screen. Is it okay? Okay, so thank you, Sabrina, and thank you, Nelly and Maya, for your wonderful exhibition. I enjoy discussing and sharing with you the work of women architects in the White City. It is even more exciting as I think this is the first exhibition in Israel in which the work of women architects is discussed in the context of the White City. And I especially delighted to be here today with Despina and Mary, my colleagues and partners to the journey of increasing the awareness of women in architecture. So women architects first started working in Eretz Israel as early as 1921, when Lotte Cohen, the first woman architect, arrived from Berlin. In the 30s, 17 women architects were already active in mandatory Palestine. Most of these women architects were part of the first group of women who studied architecture at the technical universities in Germany and Vienna. These women architects played an important part in introducing modern architecture into the new country and advancing it, thus enhancing the social and cultural fabric of the nascent Jewish community. They planned various housing projects and large buildings, public buildings, including new public institutions. Although they were never regarded collectively as one professional or social group, they did have distinctive common features that sprang from their similar European background and from similarities in the private and professional lives in the new homeland. This blend of shared properties made them a singular phenomenon. Those who had left Germany in the 20s did it for reasons of Zionist ideology. However, most of those who arrived in the 30s were forced to flee Europe after the Nazis came into power in 1933. After a rather short period of adjustment, having gained some experience, they set up to open their own independent architectural firms. They chose to settle in Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city, a modern urban center and the heart of the Jewish community. Tel Aviv was a middle-class stronghold where the building momentum included both institutional and private projects. The move to the new homeland offered them new opportunities to expand the spheres of activity by cooperating with various groups of individuals involved in buildings, public institutions. The designers of most major building projects of the Jewish community were prize winners of local architecture competitions, many of whom were women. The competitions gave local women architects an opportunity to present their designs and win large-scale projects, mostly public buildings. The jurors in these competitions were celebrated architects and engineers who held prestigious professional positions. Awarding prizes to women architects reflected confidence in their professional abilities, and no less important was a seal of approval from their male colleagues. Winning competitions paved the way for women architects to attain financial independence, set up their own firms, and further enhance their professional reputation. The fast population growth due to pre- and post-war waves of immigration created a pressing need for effective housing solutions. Planning apartment buildings, therefore, occupied a central place in the local architectural discourse and practice during the 30s and 40s. In 1935, Judith Stolzer-Segal was the winner in a public competition for designing an entire neighborhood of 160 apartments in Tel Aviv. This was the first attempt to build a cooperative housing complex for middle-class residents in the city. Cohen planned a new neighborhood in northern Tel Aviv. Gidoni planned residential buildings, and Averbuch designed urban villas and numerous apartment buildings in Tel Aviv. In planning and designing apartment buildings, women architects significantly contributed to creating a local modernist architectural language side by side with their male counterparts and colleagues. For example, to adjust the typical horizontal windows of European modernism to the local climate, long balconies were introduced with built-in shading elements. From the 20s on, Lotte Cohen, Elsa Gidoni Mandelstam, and Jenny Averbuch formed professional partnership with women's organizations that also collaborated with each other to build and maintain establishments designed for the welfare and training of women. This cooperation, where women architects planned buildings for women's organizations, laid the foundation for female solidarity and collaboration intended to advance a female agenda, which means promote modernization and welfare for the new woman in Eretz Israel. It is worth noting that those women's organizations started as international Zionist movement of volunteer women, mostly apolitical. They differ from the earlier women's organization, mostly charities of all Yishuv, as they aspire to implement new work methods in new activity spheres. Cohen, Gidoni, and Averbuch planned 15 projects, which are buildings, extensions, and refurbishing works of primarily urban social establishments designed to train women and see to their welfare and provide healthcare and education to babies and children. They manifest the close ties and deep trust between the women's organizations and the women architects. Vitsa first worked with Cohen in 1923 and trusted her with planning the agricultural school for women in Nahalal. It was the first agricultural school for women in Palestine, with classrooms and dormitories for students and teachers. Although Vitsa continued working with Cohen in the 30s, it mostly worked with Gidoni, commissioning her to plan 4 large buildings. Gidoni undertook her first project as an independent architect in 1934, winning Vitsa competition for designing the domestic science and agriculture school in Nechlat Yitzchak, today a neighborhood in Tel Aviv. In 1936, Vitsa entrusted her with designing the Vitsa House, the organization headquarters in Palestine, and also the women's lodging in a training agriculture farm, Ayanot, and the extension for the Mothercraft and Child Welfare Center in Tel Aviv's Nordia neighborhood, and modernized its interior. The large number of projects Gidoni planned for Vitsa won her the unofficial label of Vitsa's architect in the press. Gidoni cooperated with 2 other women's organizations, Moetzet HaPoalot and Leni. In 1935, she won a limited competition initiated by these organizations for designing the Women Pioneers House in Tel Aviv, lodgings and cooperative workshops for single new immigrant women. Averbuch won a competition for designing the Women Pioneers House in Jerusalem in 1939. Winning this competition marked the beginning of Averbuch's long-term professional collaboration with 5 major Zionist women's organizations. From the mid-40s through the early years of Israel's statehood, Averbuch planned for these organizations youth villages for Holocaust refugee children. And here are some more photos of Hadassim and another school in Petach Tikva and in Jerusalem. This was a real opportunity for women architects to plan modern buildings expressing social values. They were invited to participate in innovative, large-scale projects and to be partners in the general female effort to create a new civic language meant to promote women's status in Palestine. This female solidarity, whether formal or informal, defined and implemented a new social civic order. The artists Nelly Agassi and Maya Raviv chose 3 projects to work on in the exhibition, and I will present 2 of them in more detail: the training kitchen in the Vitsa House and the Women Pioneers House. The first electrically powered public kitchen in the country was the Vitsa Kitchen, a workers' restaurant with a training kitchen, which opened in 1931 and designed by Lotte Cohen. In 1936, a new training center with a training kitchen, replacing the former one, was built in the Vitsa House, designed by Elsa Gidoni Mandelstam. The notion of the scientific household was embraced enthusiastically by the Zionist women's organizations, notably Vitsa, which established a series of training kitchens in Tel Aviv. The most intensive and wide training project took place in the training center in Vitsa House. The center included a kitchen of 30 square meters and 2 classrooms next to the women's club. Women workers from the kibbutz kitchen, housewives, and even male and female soldiers took courses in cooking and rationalized domestic work. A series of exhibitions on nutrition were held in the adjacent women's club, which provided samples of different types of food and booklets of recipes. The demand for the cooking courses was so high that Vitsa established an additional training kitchen in the Vitsa house only 2 years after its opening. In 1944, Lotte Cohen planned an additional floor. I argue that the training kitchen, with its modern design, helped to construct the national identity of the new woman as a domestic woman. A well-intentioned action of Vitsa towards modernization and advancement of women's domestic work actually proved to be regressive. The new woman in mandatory Palestine contributed to nation building through her profession as a domestic worker. Yet, it is noteworthy that through its cooking classes, Vitsa also brought social change to women. The training kitchen provided space where women from different sectors of the Jewish community met and socialized. The non-formal meetings became a supportive community for immigrant women who struggled to adjust to the new society. Vitsa enterprise of the training kitchen was indeed pioneer and essential for many women. However, the training in these kitchens ultimately left them even deeper in their traditional duties. The second urban project is the Home for Single Immigrants Women by Elza Gidoni. From the early 30s on, the available housing in Tel Aviv did not meet the ever-growing demand despite a considerable construction effort. In 1933, for example, about 60% of the new immigrants who came to Palestine settled in Tel Aviv. The construction of apartment buildings did not catch up with the growing demand of housing. Single working women living in the city, most of whom were new immigrants, had many difficulties to overcome. They had trouble supporting themselves either because they could not find work or because they earned significantly less than their male counterparts, and some of them also sent money to their families in Europe. Many single women had no permanent place to live. Other than coping with difficulties of urban life, the expectation was that those single women abide by the feminine moral norms. Rooted social conventions expected women to behave respectably and be restrained and moderate. All these difficulties spread to Zionist women's organization to collaborate and construct affordable modern housing for single new immigrants. The Socialist Women Workers Council, Moetzet HaPoalot, collaborated with the Women's League for Israel, Lenny, a group of wealthy bourgeois New York matrons. In 1932, they opened the first house in Haifa. Beginning in the late 19th century, feminist women's association and wealthy matrons in Germany, Berlin, and the United States initiated and built housing and cooperatives for single women. Gusta Strumpf, a member of the Women Workers Council, revealed that in the late 20s, prior to the construction of the first house, she had visited Germany to inspect similar urban establishments for single women in Hamburg, Berlin, and Munich, and acquired knowledge on this matter. And I learned about the Berlin project from the Spina's book, A Woman's Berlin, so thank you again, the Spina. The Women's Pioneers House were part of a worldwide effort made by women to provide women with proper lodgings in the city. Here, they were offered a unique model of vocational training in cooperative work groups where women could be trained and also support themselves. They ran workshops for weaving, laundry, sewing, cooking, bookbinding, shoe repair, and even plant nurseries and wickerwork. They offered women an opportunity to acquire professional expertise and eventually earn a living. The courses and cooperatives were open for non-residents as well. The women who ran the organizations were well aware that in addition to material support, these immigrant women also needed emotional support. To provide it, the Tel Aviv house employed a psychologist who offered her services several hours every day to any residents who sought them. The houses also ran social and cultural activities to help the residents adjust to their life in the new country. These included Hebrew lessons, classes on the history and literature of Eretz Israel, sing-along evenings, listening to music, traditional Shabbat ceremonies, excursions, and dinners. Despite the significant budgetary implications involved, all these activities were open to every woman worker in the city. The house met the highest standards of its time in terms of modern planning and design and followed the healthy dwelling ideas that advocated good ventilation and adequate lighting in all spaces. The bedrooms opened on a shaded balconies where the occupants could relax and socialize in the fresh air. The common balcony overlooked a well-kept garden. The house was connected to electric grid and had a central heating infrastructure, both extremely rare at that time. Much effort was invested in advanced modern design, which very few people could afford at that time in Palestine, let alone single women. Before long, the house was occupied to capacity, with demand quickly exceeding supply. In 1947, Jenny Averbuch designed the extension and had an additional floor. In this type of advanced housing, women found a home-like supportive community where they were not alone. The house was a visible statement of the presence of women in the public sphere and made single women part of a collective. Within a short time, the house offered a variety of public activities that benefited Tel Aviv's residents. The building's modern architecture significantly contributed to the visibility of women in the city and supported their effort to participate in its public activity. The house was a visible female public space with which women could identify and which made them proud. Reviews of the buildings appeared in prominent architectural journals, in women's magazines, and in daily newspapers. They all praised its architecture and its benefits for the tenants. This project demonstrated how female cooperation succeeded in granting this marginalized group the right to have adequate lodgings at a time when this right was far from self-evident. They achieved this by combining a new domestic vision and socioeconomic strategies that were innovative for their time. A house of their own in the heart of the modern city offered single women personal and financial confidence, facilitating their adjustment to their new homeland. In so doing, it instilled in them the feeling that they had moved from the margins to the center. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sigal, for the great talk. And now we move on to our next speaker, Professor Emerita Mary Pepczynski, and her talk, The Flaneuse at Mid-Century, Simone de Beauvoir's City. Mary Pepczynski is an architectural historian, curator, and writer based in Berlin. Her research focuses on gender in architecture and urbanism, as well as biographies of women architects. She was a professor at the TU Dresden until 2021. In 2017, She was the scientific advisor for the Frau Architect exhibition at the Deutsche Architekturmuseum in Frankfurt. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Sabrina, for the introduction, and thank you to Sigal and Despina for these wonderful talks, and thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to take the discussion in a slightly different direction, away from the woman architect and really making a mark in the city, to revisiting this figure of the flaneuse, but in a feminine form, and what that means for the experience of the city. My talk takes kind of the ideas for my talk go back to 2008. 2008 was the centenary of Simone de Beauvoir's birth, and there were conferences that were held in Paris and Berlin to look at her voluminous writings. And we were encouraged, all of those who took part, to find new frameworks to look at her really extraordinary body of writings, novels, biography, philosophy, feminism, etc. And to find new frameworks to look at this body of work. And for myself as an architect and as an architectural historian, I've been looking at them and trying to kind of tease out her attitudes towards architecture and the city, or to look at Simone de Beauvoir as a theoretician of the modern woman in the modern city. So now I'm trying to go forward and it won't go. Yeah, there. Life in France at mid-century was extremely patriarchal and oppressive towards women. It is against this context that Simone de Beauvoir, the acclaimed novelist, philosopher, and feminist, viewed cities as the sites of great personal liberation, where she could move freely and make unencumbered decisions about her life. It is worth mentioning that between the age of 20 and her mid-50s, de Beauvoir did not have a permanent home, but resided in hotel rooms with friends and family and traveled. And in German, we call this unbehaust wohnen, or living unhoused. Arguably, the public sphere was also her private sphere. Written during the gestation of the second sex, her book, America Day by Day, is a fictionalized account of two journeys taken through the United States in 1947 and published in various forms beginning in 1948. It should be seen as integral to de Beauvoir's project to reimagine women's role in the contemporary world, as it identified the single woman as a legitimate user of urban space. This book is also a portrait of the modern American city at mid-century, with issues such as accessibility, marginalization, and racial separation. When America Day by Day was published, the Second World War had just come to a close. European cities lay in ruin and their populations lacked basic needs. Western governments directed women to return home to care for their families. Yet, two world wars had engendered both a sizable surplus of single women in addition to untold numbers of men left incapacitated by armed conflict. For many women, traditional ideals proved illusory. Meanwhile, women's suffrage was not universal in Western Europe. Women lacked basic legal protections and the right to have birth control. No organized women's movement existed. As the West clung to tradition, the new socialist states in the Soviet bloc embraced innovation, anchoring gender equality in their constitutions, propagating for women's work, and building infrastructure to alleviate housekeeping and childhood tasks and childcare tasks. The Second Sex, published in 1949, took aim at both traditional mores and radical social transformation, while demanding that all women reimagine their role in the world. Politicians on both the right and the left denounced de Beauvoir's criticism of the nuclear family and frank discussions of female sexuality, and the Vatican placed it on its index of heretical literature, which meant they considered her to be a witch. In 1947, Simone de Beauvoir interrupted her research for The Second Sex to travel twice to the United States for a total of roughly 5 months. Although she did not identify urbanism as a central theme of America Day by Day, it is not surprising that her experiences in the generic cities of North America, which sported rich urban culture, yet were marked by profound social and racial divisions, figure prominently in this account. On the one hand, she understood architecture and urbanism as being integral to modern culture, which she viewed as offering radical aesthetic innovation, as well as a means to personal liberation. She read urban social theory, for example, the books that we see here on the screen. And while traveling, she made a point of visiting new urban projects like the Waldsiedlung in Berlin by Tauton Wagner from roughly 1930, or Brasilia in Brazil from diverse architects beginning in the 1950s. Sometimes the ideas she encountered appear in her writings, such as Henri Lefebvre's conviction that human activity is integral to spatial production. And she also edited Lefebvre's early writings about cities and spaces for publication in Le Temps Moderne, which was an extremely influential intellectual review based in Paris, which she edited with Sartre and several others. Yet on the other hand, being keenly aware that the act of writing about urbanism was masculine territory, de Beauvoir most likely did not want to declare this her focus. She probably desired to avoid direct competition with her male counterparts, and she probably did not want to be ridiculed as a female talking about a masculine topic. Nonetheless, she intended America Day by Day to be distinct from texts about the United States, which had appeared in France, from Le Corbusier's and Paul Moran's travelogues of the 1930s, to more recent essays about American cities by Jacques-Laurent Bost and Jean-Paul Sartre, her collaborators on Le Temps Moderne. And they had visited the United States in 1945, the two men, and had also written extensively about their trips. And whereas their works feature very insightful, yet markedly cerebral and interpretive and analytical approaches to the subject. For example, Sartre writes about the wood frame buildings on the peripheries of the American cities as being evocative of the fragility and tenuousness of American civilization. In contrast, de Beauvoir wanted her book to be more personal and visceral and subjective. She wanted to reveal how she, as a white, bisexual, foreign, middle-aged woman, felt while exploring this nation and its cities. In the United States, the writers Nelson Algren, who became her lover, in Chicago, and Richard Wright in New York, introduced her to a range of social conditions, including urban poverty and racial separation, respectively, enabling her to witness the more politicized aspects of urban life. And at times she explored cities with one or the other. While traveling in the Western and Southern United States, she was joined for a time by her young friend, who she was very close to, Nathalie Sorokin Moffat. Like de Beauvoir, Moffat was new to the United States, being a French-Russian woman who had recently married an American soldier and moved to Los Angeles. In contrast to her forays with Nelson Algren or Richard Wright, when Beauvoir and Moffat were in somewhat isolated places or in areas with few white people, their presence was often met with derision and aggression. When traveling through the United States, de Beauvoir employed various modes of transportation: buses, trains, automobiles. Yet it was the simple act of walking, and particularly walking alone, and then reflecting on her sojourns, that allowed Beauvoir to test her access to metropolitan space and gain knowledge about American society. When roaming through the industrialized cities in the Northeast, for example, she was often drawn to natural features like embankments along rivers. Yet very often works of infrastructure such as trains, harbor buildings, or the highways, as we see here along Manhattan's shoreline, frustrated this desire and blocked her access. In other places, walking was either unpleasant or impossible. Manufacturing centers like Rochester were too small and lacked human scale and variety to sustain our interest, while Los Angeles's vast thoroughfares felt alien and were devoid of people. But not all areas of cities seemed strange and uninviting. Besides the sidewalks, de Beauvoir's wanderings are punctuated with stops at drugstore lunch counters or visits to the ubiquitous movie houses, where an anonymous individual can briefly partake of a collective space and feel a part of the city. And it should be noted, these are spaces which have basically vanished from the typical North American city. So they were very typical at mid-century. Implicitly, Simone de Beauvoir, a single foreign transient middle-aged white woman, could readily enter into the above-mentioned spaces. But she also wanted to test the extent of her freedom by exploring the mechanisms of racial separation. When in New York City, for example, she desired to visit Harlem, the sprawling neighborhood at the center of Manhattan. As opposed to most other areas in New York City, Black people were able to live, engage in commerce, and create culture here. Her white acquaintances, however, attempted to dissuade her by articulating their fears. They said, a white person can't go there, they will not be safe. But she ignores them. Arriving in Harlem, she walks about and observes street life. Although her presence is tolerated, she is overwhelmed by shame. Quote, I don't feel that I have the right to stroll the streets where the color of my eyes signifies injustice, arrogance, and hatred. End of quote. Walking with Nathalie Saraki Moffett in the South, she encounters a more hostile reception when she ventures into Black neighborhoods, usually located at the outskirts of the city. While in New Orleans, men jeer at them when they attempt to drink at a bar and cab drivers refuse to pick them up. In Savannah, the two white women are greeted with contempt as they cross spatial boundaries, and the child screams out enemies as they walk by. Moving through New York with Richard Wright and his wife, Ellen Poplar Wright, who, as you see here, was white, presents her with another aspect of racism, namely discrimination by association. Describing an evening with Richard Wright in a racially mixed group, she notes that they go out of their way to dine at a Chinese restaurant in Midtown Manhattan because the Chinese will serve Black customers. Wright also explains to her that when his wife pushes their mixed race child in a stroller through their Greenwich Village neighborhood, a bohemian district in Manhattan, she, quote, hears the most unpleasant comments, end of quote. Perhaps it was her close acquaintanceship with Richard and Ellen Wright that permitted de Beauvoir's descriptions for encounters with racial separation to come across as heartfelt and thoughtful. In contrast, her ruminations on social inequality or other marginalized groups sometimes seem detached, even superficial. While in Chicago, Nelson Algren takes her on a nighttime crawl through the city's Skid Row. Although appalled by the poverty, she draws upon cliché saying that such indigence could not happen in Europe to describe her reaction to these conditions. So she doesn't have the language for what she's seeing and feeling and experiencing. Likewise, when describing Los Angeles, she notes that Mexicans are the dominant minority and recounts a visit with friends to a restaurant in a Mexican neighborhood. In contrast to the unease that she felt in Harlem, she revels in the lively atmosphere there. However, she does not reflect upon why her presence did not feel like an intrusion, or why the inhabitants ostensibly did not perceive her as a threat, or that her presence as a tourist has a transactional value. Although she explored American cities when she was alone and with Nathalie Saraki Moffat, two men, Richard Wright and Nelson Algren, as noted, accompanied her to places that she could not easily access herself. With Wright, she visited a Sunday church service in the legendary Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, while Algren took her to Chicago's working class neighborhoods and the stockyards. As if to answer the question why women did not act as guides too, towards the end of America Day by Day, de Beauvoir turns her attention to, quote, the female sex, end of quote, in the United States. She struggles to comprehend the lack of independence and the sense of insecurity she observes in American women, as well as their exclusion from the, quote, masculine world, end of quote. We might understand these musings as her acknowledgement that her wanderings through American cities were an anomaly and could only have taken place by an alien who was not bound by local convention. The strengths and failings of America Day by Day notwithstanding, de Beauvoir implicitly declared that women have a right to inhabit the shared spaces of the modern city. Nonetheless, the book's ruminations about anti-Black racism remind her readers that uninhibited access to metropolitan space for all citizens remains an illusion. Indeed, this book's message was also one of pessimism, as the modern American city that de Beauvoir presents was a contested terrain, and no one person, no matter how privileged, enjoyed unimpeded access to all of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for the wonderful talk. And thank you, Despina and Sigal. It was really, really inspiring and really wonderful. And I will ask now to all of our speakers to join us, as well as the artists, Nelly Agassi and animator Maya Raviv. And we will open our discussions to our guests. And for any questions, you're very welcome to join us. And I will just introduce shortly Nelly and Maya. So Nelly Agassi is a Chicago-based artist. She's a multidisciplinary artist who works with performance, installation, video, textiles, sound, and works on paper. She has her MFA from Chelsea College and a BFA from Central St. Martin's, both in London. Her work has been shown in international institutions and galleries, including the Arts Club in Chicago, Hyde Park Art Center, the Israeli Museum, Tate Modern, Tel Aviv Museum of Art, La Triennale di Milano, and Agassi is a co-founder of the nonprofit organization Fieldwork Collaborative Projects and a 2019 Graham Foundation Fellow in Chicago. Maya Raviv, a London-based motion designer and animator. Raviv creates works in the field of culture and art and works for the commercial market where she collaborates with artists, musicians, and choreographers. She also creates work in needlefelt and other handcrafts. Raviv has an MA from Central St. Martin's and BA of honors from the LCC, both in London. Her works have been shown at the Haifa Film Festival, the Tel Aviv Cinematheque, International Video Dance Festival, and at the Milan Design Exhibition and various exhibitions in the US. So welcome everyone. And so I will see if we have any questions from our speakers. And first of all, you're very welcome if you have something to say or to add also to each other, you're very welcome. The floor is yours. So maybe we will start with a short question to Nelly and Maya on the work, on these subjects and topics, and the works with the research of Sigal. Maybe you can share with us some of your thoughts and how it influenced your work.
Maya or me? Okay, I can start a little bit. First, it was a very fascinating project to work on together. Maya and I, we started to create the idea for this show in the relationship to the White City, thinking about presence, what is present, what is not, what do we know, what did we forget, and all those questions came along. And I won't get you into the whole process, but in the end, we actually chose to work with very deep and inspiring and beautiful research by Sigal, because we decided that we actually want to look into buildings that are here and around us in Tel Aviv, though I'm in Chicago, but I'm a Tel Avivian, and Maya as well. She's in London, but she's very much, from Tel Aviv, lived in Tel Aviv. So we know those places very well, and we walked around those buildings for so many years and not necessarily acknowledge the history of those buildings that we pass by every day. And those are super important histories as part of the fabric of the city of Tel Aviv. And we decided that it's important, though the buildings are so present, but actually the ladies that designed them and thought about it and conceptualized them, they're a little forgotten, and it was very important for us to bring them back to kick and to revisit their fascinating way of thinking, especially in relation to the building of Tel Aviv and Israel, and also in relation to Europe and the world. Maya, I'm sorry I talked a lot. You're silent.
Just a second before,
Oh, yeah.
Mary, can you just stop the share? I think you still are sharing your screen.
I've stopped it.
Yeah. Okay. So
it's gone now.
Okay.
You're all
Yes, it's
set.
fine now. So
Okay.
it's fine. Thank you. Yes, Maya. Sorry.
Yes, I agree with. I mean, everything that Nelly said is. It was a very interesting process to the research. As Nelly said, we started with something, with one thing, and then we were exposed to Sigal's research, and it just took us to another place. And these buildings, the history, the women that designed it, created it, the women who actually lived there, that I think in the opening of the exhibition, we even met someone that used to live there. And yeah, it was an incredible project. I mean, I enjoyed working on it. So, and we're trying to take it with us maybe elsewhere. It's not the end.
Thank you very much. We have a question from the chat from Dalia Hacker. So we are letting her into the chat. Dalia, are you with us? Do you wanted to ask a question? We can all see you. Waiting for Dalia. In the meantime, we have another question from our chat. From Pumi, that's his name on here. Did you find that Vitsa gave preference to women architects? I guess this is to Sigal.
Yes, thank you for the question. It is actually this is a question that I always people ask me. whether they had these women architects had the priority or preference to design this building. So I would say yes and no. I mean, this was at the beginning. These were competitions, and that Vitsa organized, but they kept invited every time to every competition at least one office of a woman architect. So from the beginning, they wanted women to participate in the exhibition. So if there were usually it was a limited exhibition for 5 officers. At least one woman architect participated, and there was anonymous competitions. So they actually couldn't know who designed this, but they after that. In the letters, they wrote that they were very, very happy that a woman won in the competition, and later on they gave them the project without competition. They developed a very good relationships, and they even became friends. And in the letters, you can see that they are really enjoy to work together. Gidoni, for example, she worked here for 5 years, but she never learned Hebrew. So all the letters were in German. And the secretary of Vitsa told her, okay, if you don't understand the contract, I will translate it for you on the phone, or we can together figure out the contract as we did in the former buildings. So it was very informal relationships, and it seems that they enjoyed to work together. If I look at the letters to Richard Kaufmann, they also worked with him. So it was very formal, not as they wrote to Gidoni and Cohen.
Thank you very much, Sigal. Another question to Nelly and Maya. I would love to hear more about your choice of the Flaneuse. Why this figure in relation to buildings? How does she connect us to forgotten histories?
Us again.
I think she has the privilege to walk around and observe, and Maya and I were thinking about it a little bit like window shopping, trying on and off. So those are not clothes or dresses we're trying, but actually wearing the building in and out, on and off, up and down. Future and past. So that's, I feel, one of the connection, but also we wanted to turn around the term and to take it more of a direction, of a feminine direction, because of course a lot of people are very familiar with this term, and we wanted to twist it slightly. And Maya, you can join any.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we just saw the city as fabric, and she was just wandering around and trying and taking off and on, as you said, the old city next to the new, the very tall buildings next to the kind of nice old ones. And
right,
it
like
was she was exploring, just exploring the city. We had this figure from previous project that we've done, the woman architect, so it's like an ongoing thing for her, just going to a new place and wandering around, I guess.
Thank you very much.
And especially in Tel Aviv, and you know, it's called the White City, but it's not actually white, and it's very interesting to see what is demolished, what is still there, how how you keep some buildings from the historical part, but then you add this high rise next to them, connected to them. So it's very interesting to look on the city fabric, how it develops, and how the time changes the architecture, the needs of the city. If the city is pretty small and there are more people coming in, then buildings are going higher. And that's fascinating to see the seams between, for example, high rises to the buildings that has historical meaning and needed to be preserved and protected. So, like textiles, I guess.
I have a comment here. I will read you from Katarina Bosi. More a comment than a question. I love the urban directions map in Despina's talk, indicative of the ordered movement of the modern architect. Sorry, just a moment. Interesting to hear how Simone de Beauvoir decades later still struggles to navigate the city, although for different reasons. So I think it's a very interesting remark about movement as a part of the women presence, and you both really addressed it in your talks. Yeah. Would you like to add something about that?
Despina, do you want to start? Okay, I think it's one interesting thing is I think it was just interesting that Sigal and Despina really wanted to show how women want to become permanent and really visible in the city, and Simone de Beauvoir, you know, attempts almost the opposite in a way you could say, or is experiencing that. But getting back to her sort of loss of orientation, she kind of wants that, and she very often compares cities to landscapes. She loved to, on the weekends, she would just love to go into the countryside somewhere wherever she was and just walk for hours with a little rucksack and a little backpack. And she compares that to the city streets as well, just sort of this endless walking through the space and what can you experience and everything else. So I think it's less about really these secure zones and places where you can move, but really for her at least testing the limits, sort of the limits of one's own freedom. And that has a lot to do with her own biography, but that's maybe the big idea, you know, what are the limits of my freedom as a woman and as a particular person in this city?
And I think that underscores too, for me, all of these presentations and the comments about the exhibition, just how central subjectivity is in defining the flanerie or the flaneuse, and how it's so different, and that it's challenging that we've started with the model of the flaneur, because it's just so different in terms of hearing about the ways in which the private exists in the public, or that community, that you find community as a flaneuse in places like the movie house. I think those are really radically different from the ways that the flaneur has been imagined. So to me, these point to sort of the challenges in, you know, when we write about women or we look at women's history, of how we pick up frameworks that might actually not always be so helpful or well suited, but that we kind of have to work as writers, as artists, as historians. We have to kind of work both with and against those frameworks.
Thank you very much. I have another question. Do you think that women have a better eye exploring the city and paying attention to its architecture and structure? Anybody want to answer that?
With a different eye, I would say.
Different.
Mm-hmm.
Not better or worse, but different.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask another question, and that is to the three of you are actually working on these histories of women architects, and I was wondering how you feel this heritage you are constructing, because a lot of it was missing a few years ago, influences today. Like, how does this history and heritage influence architecture, the city today, or women's lives in them today? And that's to every one of you.
And maybe I'll just start quickly. I was really, when I put this talk together, I was so, she talks about these sort of in-between spaces that she experiences when she gets to a city as a way to kind of then enter the city, you know, the drugstore, the movie theater, she gets her hair done, et cetera, et cetera. But I was just, you talked about heritage and the vanishing city. And these, I'm from New York, and these were places that I can remember from my childhood. They're just not there anymore. And if you come to New York from Tel Aviv or Chicago, or wherever, Germany in the world, they're just not there. You just kind of wander around the streets saying, you know, I can go shopping or here or wherever, but these little in-between spaces are gone. And I think this isn't heritage preservation, preserving works, but it's another aspect of urban life that kind of gets pushed away for all sorts of economic reasons and everything else that I think is nevertheless worth thinking about when one thinks about what do we preserve of the city. And for a woman to enjoy the city.
Thank you very much. So
I'll just say that I think that when I think about my students, that there's a kind of narrative or a kind of flânerie in the experience of rediscovering women's histories, which I think Nelly and Maya have also really captured with the exhibition. But there's something kind of that rings true in terms of that discovery in the context of both the city and women's past lives, and that feeling of being an explorer and a discoverer that never really has, or at least not yet, hasn't really changed across generations. I think I still see my students experiencing that as well.
Yeah, just a short note that I also think it is so important to have this knowledge now, because this is a missing part in the history in our history in Israel and in Tel Aviv, especially because most of them lived and worked in Tel Aviv. And it's also how we decide what to preserve and what not, because just recently building by Elza Gidoni was demolished in Tel Aviv because it was not part of the conservation plan, because nobody knew about her. And I think the more people will know about those women and their importance to the development of the modern city, they will think differently about if we should preserve their buildings or not.
Thank you very much. So if any of you have some more questions, even to each other, or something open you would like to discuss, and if not, we will conclude. I'm sorry, we have another. Katarina Borsi says, Sigal's work has helped me to reevaluate German modernism. So I want to thank you all. It was really, really a wonderful and inspiring evening. And I think this having a look from these different perspectives and through the work of Nelly and Maya that inspired really this and generated all this talk today has made it all really worthwhile and really, I think, opened up new ways of looking at our city and our history and at also the present moment. I think to think of it differently and to go out to the city and to explore. So thank you very much to everybody. And I think, wait, I'm looking if we have some more. I get a lot of comments that it was really wonderful, and thank you all for the really, really interesting talks. So that's it for tonight. So we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.